Stay connected to your community and save. Just 99 cents a month gets you 3 months of unlimited access to Inform.com. Visit Inform.com/subscribe and get your first 3 months of news for only 99 cents a month.
A former Fargo woman said her pilot father once brought Amelia Earhart home for dinner and a night of incredible stories. Hi, this is Tracy Briggs, and welcome to Back Then. Can you imagine the phone call Clarence Bates made to his wife, Janu, on that unusual day on the job at Hector Airport in Fargo? Hi, honey. I'm leaving work now. Sure, I'll pick up a loaf of bread. Also, I'm bringing Amelia Earhart home for dinner. Of course, I'm completely speculating about this phone call, but we can let our minds wander just a little bit as we unravel the mystery of the night one of America's aviation pioneers is said to have dined with the Fargo family, and how that story came to light in the first place. It starts in October of 2022 when I wrote a story about a deadly Northwest Airlines plane crash in Moorhead in 1941. The only survivor was the pilot, Clarence Bates. He was thrown from the window upon impact. Now, of course, that story was tragic, but because Bates survived, he was able to provide aviation investigators with important information about the possible causes of that crash. Icing was ruled the likely culprit, and how some of those problems could be prevented in the future. Now, sadly, 1 year after surviving that crash, Bates was killed testing B-24s for the U.S. Army. So, while I was doing this story, I stumbled across Clarence Bates' obituary, and I found a letter written by his daughter, Barbara Bates Schoening. She wrote it to the Star Tribune in 2010, and she talked about the glory days of Northwest Airlines and her father's time working at Hector Airport in Fargo before his death. This is what she said. My father, Clarence Bates, was a romantic, barnstorming white silk scarf and helmeted pilot in the 1920s and 30s. He loved flying more than money. He joined Northwest Airlines as operations manager at Hector Field in Fargo in 1933. Amelia Earhart was stranded at the Fargo airport, and he invited her to our home for supper, where she regaled our family with tales of her exploits. Say that again, Barbara? You broke bread with an aviation heroine? You're going to need to tell us more about this. So I wanted to find out whether this story was true, when it happened, all the details. So here's what I did. I went into the forum archives to see what I could find about any possible reporting of the story, and I came up empty. I didn't find any headlines, any stories, nothing. I also didn't get any information from historians or aviation experts here in town. They were not aware that Amelia Earhart had ever come here. So I was also having a lot of difficulty finding Barbara Bates. Then, this is where the story gets really weird. I had written a story that was a little more vague than the story that I'm telling you now and that's now published on Inform. It was more just looking into the mystery, and I was set to publish that. Frustrated that I didn't have more of the details or even confirmation that it happened, but I wanted to turn in something and let you know that I was looking into it. Again, so that was going to publish. But one day before that was going to be published, I got an email from a woman named Elizabeth Dolphin. She happens to be Barbara Bates' stepdaughter. Now, she was emailing me because she had run across that story I had done on the Northwest Airlines plane crash from 1941. Now, think about this. I published that story. We published that story in October of last year. All those months ago. But she didn't email me. She hadn't seen it. She hadn't read it until just the last couple of days. So what a fluke. She read it. She said she liked it. She even read it to Barbara Bates, her stepmother, and she just wanted to reach out. So, of course, that's when I reached out to Elizabeth and asked her all about her stepmother's story about Amelia Earhart. So kind of a fluky, fortuitous happening here that helped me really round out the edges of this story. And what I found out was it was absolutely true. It happened. Amelia Earhart's visit to Fargo happened in the winter of 34 or 35. Now, Barbara was not quite sure when. She couldn't really narrow down when it was, but it was winter time. She was about 7 or 8 years old. And it turns out Amelia Earhart had been a pretty frequent visitor to this region over the last couple of years in the early 30s. days. According to the Delta Flight Museum, in 1933, Amelia Earhart rode along as an observer on a Northwest Airways survey flight to help convince Washington officials that a northern transcontinental route between Chicago and Seattle was feasible in the wintertime. So, one stormy night that next winter of 34-35, Earhart was again headed for Seattle on this route when she stopped in Fargo to refuel. However, she was unable to take off again because of bad visibility. So that is when Hector Operations Manager Clarence Bates, again, he was the pilot in that story I initially told you about, and the father of Barbara Bates, that is when he invited Earhart over for dinner. Barbara Bates told Forum columnist Bob Lynn back in 1998 that her father was, quote, hospitable to the bone, end quote, often bringing guests home for dinner. Now, Barbara was a student at the time at Horace Mann Elementary School in North Fargo, and she says she didn't think much of it when Earhart walked through the door, but her opinion changed very quickly. This is what she later wrote of the occasion. The night that Amelia Earhart spent with us is a warm, pleasant memory. She had freckles, just like mine. I hated mine. However, there was Amelia, whose face was covered with freckles. It was a comfort to me. I had recently been told what a wonderful role model she was. She was someone who was making history, setting new goals for women, and was someone to be emulated. Not only was she comfortable with her own freckles, but she was very kind to me. She answered all of my simple questions with grace and patience. She partook in our modest supper with praise for my mother's cooking. She was very attentive and respectful of my father and kind to my grandmother, who always lived with us. She was also friendly with my 10-year-old brother, who was in awe of her. So again, that was something Barbara Bates wrote many years later about that night with Amelia Earhart. But Barbara said later when she and her brother went to school the next day, nobody believed that Amelia Earhart had really dined with them. So she was kind of sad about that. But finally, the truth came out because the Forum did publish a little report later that Earhart had been stranded. A side note, I have no idea why I was not able to find that in the archives, lost, tucked away in the file drawers that I never found. So fortunately, there is a little story about that there. Earhart's visit to Fargo in 1934 or 35 didn't receive quite the fanfare her bigger excursions to Bismarck received in 1933, that earlier one I told you about. The Bismarck Tribune took note of that visit. It's super interesting to see. The headlines splashed across the page about how she was visiting Bismarck and how she planned to do more commercial flying. That is written in the paper, the Bismarck Tribune, that day. Also, though, in that paper, was the headline that somebody named Adolf Hitler had just seized power in Germany. So very interesting. If you want to see that full front page story, kind of interesting to look at, it's in this story online at inform.com. I just love old newspapers and all the interesting stories you can read and even the old commercials and advertisements you can find. So, but I digress. Also, if you're interested in more about learning about this transcontinental route that Amelia Earhart was taking when she got stranded in Fargo, the Montana Historical Society has kind of a neat video. They took some video when she was flying from Bismarck to Helena, when she started in Minneapolis to Bismarck to Helena and then on to Seattle. And it's kind of a neat old film of how she was flying. So check that out online on YouTube. You can either search it at Amelia Earhart in Helena. That would get you there. Or again, it is linked on my story on inform.com. After Earhart's many trips across the upper Midwest, the aviation industry was able to surmise that indeed air travel in the dead of winter in the Dakotas and Minnesota indeed was feasible. What's kind of interesting, though, is in the routes that she did take and the trips she did take, I saw several reports that they had said they did run into some pretty tough weather up here. And again, she was stranded in Fargo at one point. So, but I guess they deemed it feasible because Northwest officially opened that route months later. Sadly, about 3 years later, on July 2nd, 1937, Earhart disappeared somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. Of course, the world mourned an aviation pioneer who inspired a generation of women to soar through the sky and let one little girl in Fargo know that it's pretty cool to have freckles. And that is it for Back Then. I hope you'll catch up with us again next time.
Get reliable and accurate local news with Inform.com. Inform.com is your trusted local news source with journalists dedicated to keeping you informed about what's happening in your community. Visit Inform.com now.